Well, three MPs, we don't know who they are, have been given protection, chauffeur-driven cars, after concerns about their safety.
That's right. Both Conservative and Labour parties had their security upgraded after a risk assessment.
Don't forget, earlier this month, pro-Palestinian protesters held demonstrations outside the home of the Conservative MP Tobias Ellwood, and this was the Jewish MP Andrew Percy in the House of Commons only last week.
For months I've been standing up here talking about the people on our streets, demanding death to Jews, demanding jihad, demanding intifadas, as the police stand by and allow that to happen. Last night, a genocidal call for from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, was projected onto this building. That message says no Jew is welcome in the state of Israel or in that land.
And there are these scenes from pro-Palestinian protesters that brought Tower Bridge to a halt this weekend.
And the Labour Shadow Minister Lisa Nandy revealed that she now carries a police alarm wherever she goes because she fears for her safety, and she calls it a very typical experience for MPs.
So, to offer us a unique perspective on this, actually, almost unique, is Brendan Cox, co-founder of Survivors Against Terror and the widower of the murdered MP, Jo Cox, who joins us now. Good morning, Brendan. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. When you see that sort of compilation that we did there of the mood and how febrile and full of aggression it appears to be, and so much division, what's your reaction to those pictures?
I think both those pictures, but the wider situation at the moment is one that we need to worry about. And we need to worry about it both because of, obviously, safety to MPs, not just MPs actually, but councillors and others involved in politics, journalists as well. But I think we also need to worry about it because of the state of our democracy. We need to be able to debate issues without fear or favour. We need to be able to engage with our politicians and have angry, passionate debates where we viscerally disagree with each other. But as soon as that tips over into hatred, as soon as that tips over into intimidation or into violence, we undermine the entire basis of our democracy. So I do think we need to take it much more seriously than we have.
What's changed things, Brent? Your wife was murdered in 2016 by a far-right fanatic. The backdrop, of course, was the referendum. David Amess was a Conservative MP slain in his constituency surgery a couple of years ago by an Islamist fanatic. Is there a common theme here, social media?
I think that is certainly part of it. Now, obviously, Jo and David Amess were murdered by terrorists who sought to divide our country, who sought to turn communities against each other. And it wasn't social media that they used to do that. It was on the streets of our country. But I do think that there is a backdrop that social media has enabled whereby previously, if you had extreme views, it was pretty hard to find fellow travellers. It was not very easy. You might have to go to a meeting, you might have to go to a weird book club somewhere to join up with these other extremists. I think now it is much easier online, but also I think it is sucking in a much wider group of people who probably wouldn't see themselves as extremists, but end up liking posts saying the problem with Jews is X or the problem with Muslims is Y. And I think until we as the public get better at tackling those sort of antecedents, the conditions that create and support extremism, I think that's the thing where we can have a real impact. And until we get better at that, I think there is a danger that we will see more of that. I also think it's not just the public that have a responsibility here. I think also politicians. I think politicians who inflame debates, who seek to use moments of tension for their own political ends, who use language that dehumanizes whole groups of people, I think are also a big part of this problem.
Is that one of the consequences? Sarah Vine has written in the Mail today, Brendan, about her ex-husband Michael Gove when the murderer who killed David Amess was outside their home, I think 7 times. The consequence is now the police have to know whenever he's in his constituency, when he's at a constituency surgery. It's not advertised in advance, and that's an important part of an MP's relationship with their constituents. the surgery where people can go and sort out their problems, if that can no longer be advertised, that's a direct consequence now, isn't it, of the fact MPs have to be so much more careful. And this is how democracy, in a sense, is being subverted by the mob.
Absolutely. And I think it's something that we don't take seriously enough. I think there are two impacts of it. So the first is that it removes our MPs from engagement with the public as much as they would like to. So that idea of a constituency MP, we have relatively small constituencies, around 70,000 people per constituency. And the point of that is so that you can have that link. So you can chat to your MP down the local pub, or you can go and see them at their local constituency, or you can stop them as they go shopping on a Saturday morning and say, I'm a bit worried about whether it's congestion or Brexit or immigration or the cost of living or whatever it is. And when we create an atmosphere where that becomes hard, it removes our politicians from engagement with that public, and that undermines our ability to hold them accountable. The second reason it's a problem is because not just that physical engagement and intimidation and threat, but also what they're facing online means there's a whole generation of people, really talented people, who won't want to go into politics. Why would you want to go into politics if you think that you're going to be at risk? Why would you go into politics if you think you won't be able to go shopping on a Saturday morning without being harangued in the street? Michael Gove, a great example of that. You know, obviously he's in politics and has developed a thick skin, but people thinking about coming into politics shouldn't have to put up with that risk.
We saw what was an unprecedented event in the House of Commons last week, Brendan, with the vote on whether there should be a ceasefire in Gaza that was described by some as effectively being hijacked by the mob because there were MPs who'd received threats of violence if they didn't vote for a ceasefire, and that thereby influenced the way that procedure was handled in the House of Commons, with Keir Starmer putting pressure perhaps on Sir Lindsay Hoyle, the Speaker of the House. Given the impact of a small number of people, if that is true, that have threatened MPs, do you understand the public mood whereby there will be people, and our inbox will be full of them today, saying, no, we need to push back on what they see as an Islamification of British politics?
What do you mean by an Islamification of British politics, sir?
I think what they would say is that particularly in relation to the Middle East, that there is a pressure here that is anti-Semitic, perhaps, which is supporting the Palestinians, which is supporting the Muslim vote as well, because a lot of people playing politics with this issue as well, of course, with an election this year. I guess that is why they would see, some people would say that is happening here.
So I think what is definitely happening is that there are people who are Islamists, and there are people who are far right, who are using what has happened in Gaza and Israel over the last period to drive both anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim hatred. And that is a major problem. And I also think, a separate point, but I also think that changing our procedures in Parliament to respond to threats is not the way we should proceed. We should face down those threats, we should take on those threats, and we should deal with them through law enforcement. But we also need to be very careful to make sure that we're supporting noisy democratic protests. We want to have people marching in our streets if they disagree with the government, whether it's on Brexit, whether it's on Gaza, whatever the issue is. That is a core part of our lively democratic debate. We then need to make sure there are really clear lines and boundaries whereby if you do call for genocide against Jews, or you call for attacks against Muslims, or you call for people to be individually targeted with violence, then the police take action. So I think we just need to be very careful here that we don't end up pouring petrol on these flames, on these embers, because I do think that's what politicians have done over this last period. You've seen it historically from the Labour Party in terms of the problem that it's got with anti-Semitism. I think they're starting to deal with that now, but it is still a major issue within parts of the Labour Party. I also think you've got a major problem with anti-Muslim hate amongst bits of the Conservative Party, which Lee Anderson, which Suella Braverman have been actively stoking in this last week. And if they had said that about Jews, it would have been completely unacceptable. And I think the Prime Minister should have taken a stronger line than he has in calling out anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim hate. One doesn't justify the other.
Can we back to where we started this conversation, Brendan? 3 women MPs, Tory and Labour, we don't know who they are, have now got protection from potential violent attacks. You lost your own wife because of a fanatic. Would you recommend to young women, young men, a career in politics today?
It's a very big question. I mean, I think that the thing that I hear from MPs is often that it is hardest for their families who are most engaged. Because, particularly after what happened to Joe and what happened to David Amess, when they get a phone call from a withheld number, when their MP partner is out at a constituency surgery, they worry. They worry that that might be the police calling them, that something awful has happened to them. So it's hard for me to sort of recommend it without people going through that thought process. And I do think there's a risk that people with families in particular, women in particular, and people from minority groups are probably less likely to want to go into politics because of that threat. But we have to face that threat down, because otherwise it will cheapen, it will undermine our democracy. And I think there's things that we can all do on that. Of course, there's a big responsibility for politicians. Politicians should turn down the rhetoric. They should turn down the way that they're engaging in this, not to put petrol on those flames. But also, we as members of the public, what extremists seek to do is, of course, they seek to divide communities. And the best response to them is to draw closer together. So if there's an Islamist extremist who is trying to turn the rest of Britain against Muslims as a group, so then to be able to make it easier to recruit Muslims, the best way of responding to that is not by talking about the Islamification of Britain, but is actually about building stronger links with people from British Muslim communities and isolating those extremists. The same is true on the far right, to draw people across and to make sure that we're not allowing people to divide us from each other. That is the best response to terrorism, and that's the place where we can all have an impact.
OK. Thank you, Brendan. Fascinating as always. Thanks so much for your time this morning. It's always illuminating, isn't it, when you
Absolutely.
listen.
Well, I mean, would you want your kids to go into politics?
Yeah.
Well,
I would.
Yeah.
I mean, look, there's threats in all jobs.
Cheers.
There's threats in all jobs. And crikey, do we need good people?
We do.
In politics, we do. And like I say, I'd like to think that this is something that would be temporary at the moment, because tensions are running so high because of the miserable situation in Palestine, the misery that is being caused there at the moment for both sides of that really complicated debate.
And of course, the big marches, which seem to happen every week in London now, I think are adding to the tension, I feel, because so much of it is linked to anti-Semitic abuse. Not only a small minority, but the small minority always make a lot of noise.
Yeah, but you see, as Brendan was saying then, if you quell that
That's
dissent,
right.
if you silence that,
No.
then that will just come out in other ways.
The right to protest is important.
It is, and it's people who feel that they have less identity here, they have no power here. It's people who feel that they are being forgotten in the cultural shift that we're experiencing and marginalised. Therein lies the incendiary moments that become hate and division and violence.